You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 19, A Double Reverse. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Norman Lau.
Each week on Gene-ology, we explore the back catalog of Gene Roddenberry's early TV writing, examining it for the kind of morals, messages, and meanings that he planted in his later work.
This week, we're going to drag you into another episode and analysis of West Point, the 1950s military series on which Gene was a staff writer.
I'll be back with trivia in a moment, but first Norm is going to tell you all how you can reach us.
Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X, formerly known as Twitter, and Facebook at MissionLogPod. While you're at it, leave us a review and a rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now, here's Earl Green with this week's trivia.
Thank you very much, Norman. Everyone, please bear with me as I drag you into just a little bit of trivia here, but only a little bit this week. We're on Season 1, Episode 13 of West Point, which aired on December 28th, 1956, just 3 weeks after Gene's last script for the show. But this was not West Point's official Christmas episode. That aired a week earlier. Our guest stars this week are Don Durant as Cadet Stan Colton, a very early role in Don's short but storied on-screen career. He was a former West Pointer himself, and Don actually had the distinction of technically having been in the U.S. Army and the Naval Reserve at the same time. A year after his West Point appearance, he landed a starring role in Roger Corman's She-Gods of Shark Reef, and continued to make the TV guest starring rounds, appearing in numerous anthology shows and series like Perry Mason, Maverick, and The Twilight Zone. Early in 1959, he made his second appearance on Zane Grey Theater in an episode titled The Loner, in which Don starred as gunfighter Johnny Ringo. Later that year, a Johnny Ringo series was launched, the first series produced by a young Aaron Spelling, and Don continued playing Johnny Ringo for that show's 38-episode run, as well as composing and singing the show's theme song. The show was a legitimate hit, but keep in mind the late 50s were still the heyday of shows with a single sponsor, and somewhere, somehow, Johnny Ringo ran afoul of the Johnson Wax Company, which put pressure on CBS to cancel the series. Don stayed in showbiz until the early 60s, but as opportunities began to dry up, he shifted his interest to real estate, and apparently did quite well for himself. His final on-screen acting appearance was in a 1963 episode of Wagon Train. We lost Don in 2005. This is also an early career entry for Cynthia Baxter playing Doreen Wells. She would go on from here to make guest appearances on The Burns and Allen Show and Father Knows Best, before becoming primarily a stage actress with parallel careers in writing prose and charitable works. She made a handful of movie appearances through the 1990s, working frequently with director Mike Nichols, which also means that by coincidence, more than by design, she appeared in several movies with Jack Nicholson. Her last film appearance to date was Nichols' 1998 film Primary Colors.
All right, Grandpa, fire when ready.
Bang. Me next. That is if he's got another cannonball left.
Hi.
Hi.
How's the headache?
Fine. I mean, it's much better.
Listen, you're still going back to New York today?
11 o'clock bus.
Just killing time?
Well, I thought I'd borrow your thinking spot.
Be my guest.
What? You were here first.
No, you can use it.
Oh, that's all right. I can find another monument.
Say,
Yes?
what I was thinking was, maybe you'd like to take a walk. But it's kind of bad in high heels.
Oh, they don't bother me. Really.
Well, we kind of understand each other. I mean, you made it pretty clear. You're not interested in dragging or anything.
You're a career man, like you said. Girls and things can wait till after graduation.
That's right. So I figured I could sort of show you around like a professional guide or something. No strings attached.
No complications.
That is, if you'd like.
Act 1. Cadet Lieutenant Thompson welcomes us to West Point once again, but not at the usual spot on campus. Instead, he's standing guard near the Thayer Gate, the south entrance to West Point, the visitor's entrance, which means this is where one will find the girlfriends of some of the cadets checking in, or as Cadet Thompson calls them, drags. And arriving at West Point are two girls, Carol and Doreen. Carol's boyfriend is a West Point cadet named Ray, but appropriately enough, she's dragged her friend Doreen up to West Point for a blind date with Ray's bunkmate, Stan. Doreen's already in a terrible mood because the two of them couldn't get a room to themselves and have to share a room with other girls. And besides, why even bother when Doreen doesn't think a West Point graduate can keep her in the style to which she's accustomed? Not saying that Doreen is high maintenance or anything, mind you. Carol reminds her that all she has to suffer through is the company of some gossipy girls and a double date, and that's it. But Doreen's also having to suffer through literally every girl she's bunking with singing the praises of those West Point men. Well, except for Stan, maybe. Word has it he's a bit too career-minded, too straight-laced. But he's also on the basketball team, and that means, you guessed it, we'll need a sports montage. Guess what? Doreen's not crazy about basketball either. That afternoon, as other cadets and their drags enjoy snacks and a bit of dancing, Stan and Doreen get to know each other, and Doreen's still not impressed. Stan's just plain awkward, already advertising that he hasn't exactly been practicing his dancing, and he's basically got his nose in his textbooks all the time. She's glad Stan isn't talking about himself a whole lot. It gives her more time to complain about being here at all, until Stan offers to show her around the grounds so they can get some fresh air. He introduces her to the West Point Battle Monument, which is a spot Stan visits if something is troubling him. Monuments don't impress Doreen either, not even when Stan mentions that his great-grandfather is one of the men memorialized there. Conversation turns to the big dance tonight, and it sounds like neither of them are really looking forward to it. Well, see you later. Back at the hotel room, Doreen vents her annoyance with this whole ritual. She says the whole thing's a marriage market filled with, in her words, certified, government-approved young men. Carol accuses Doreen of projecting her problems onto everyone else. Doreen is the one who's really doing the husband hunting. Everyone else is just trying to enjoy their social lives. But Doreen says she's going to cancel on the dance. She just wants nothing to do with it. Act 2. Doreen calls Stan from the phone in the hotel lobby to cancel, and Stan awkwardly admits that he was considering canceling just to let her off the hook. He can tell she's not into the dance, or into him. No hard feelings. Suits Doreen just fine. She says she has a headache and plans to catch the late bus back to New York instead of going to the dance. But it's a really late bus, 2 hours away. Doreen decides she'll find herself a thinking spot and walks out to the monument Stan showed her earlier. Hey, guess who's already at his thinking spot? Stan's there too, feeling a bit like he blew it. He's a bit surprised to see Doreen here and offers to give her the official tour of West Point. As they visit a spot called Flirtation Walk, they discover they have a common interest in the history of the Roman Empire. They also visit the Kissing Rock. Stan says that, according to tradition, if a cadet doesn't kiss the girl he's with, in his words, the foundations of West Point will crumble. Though he also admits that this sounds like an excuse for cadets to plant a kiss on their dates. Stan's tour hasn't chewed through a lot of time, so they decide they're going to go to the formal dance after all. The dance where nobody expected to see either of them. Carol and the other girls catch a truly unexpected sight. Not only are Stan and Doreen dancing, but Doreen's actually smiling. They're probably still talking about Roman emperors or something. As Stan walks Doreen back to her hotel, they suddenly realize it's nearly 1 a.m. Stan's in danger of breaking curfew, and Doreen has missed her bus. In a rushed, disjointed way, Stan admits he'd like her to stay instead of catching the next bus home. Despite all of their talk of no strings attached, he's starting to grow fond of the idea of strings being attached. And with one eye on his watch, he just plants a kiss on her lips and then races toward the barracks. That was sudden, but Doreen's actually not annoyed by it. Doreen's roommates are fawning over the fact that one of them has a fresh engagement ring on her finger, when Doreen surprises them all by walking in the door, having obviously missed her ride home. By 2 hours. So, yeah, love is in the air, and the other girls, having spied Doreen and Stan at the dance, took the liberty of bringing her bags back to the room so she could stay. The end.
Nice, tight, and to the point recap there, Earl. I'm glad that you didn't have to drag us through a long one.
I tried not to drag it out.
We're going to be bringing that particular word up more often than not, I think, in this episode, because it's such an interesting thing. And you know how we love like getting into our historical anachronisms, hearing things in this era that were staple phrases in a previous era or even eras before that. So that's where I want to start with this. Like Charles Thompson, our host for every episode, who's not an actual cadet, but an actor, he says, when Miss Doreen Wells passed through here, it was immediately obvious that she was not a typical drag. But then there's no such thing as a typical cadet either. And it's like a very good example of like a Rod Serling intro in West Point, because it sets the tone really well.
Yeah, but, he's got kind of a twinkle in his eye when he says it. West Point is not exactly solving the ills of the world. It's not a heavy show. We get funny moments more often than not, but I think this lets us know, just kind of that sly smile on his face lets us know we're in for maybe a little bit more funny than usual this week.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he is right about one thing. Doreen is probably not typical of the girls who show up at West Point, because boy, does she not want to be there. And I don't go through everything of Gene's trying to compare it or parallel it to something later in Star Trek. But is it just me, or did I get huge Metamorphosis vibes here? Doreen's
not just you.
Utter joylessness reminds me of what a bundle of laughs Eleanor Donahue's character is before Zephram Cochrane wins her over. There's a very similar contour to this relationship, except that at first, and this is kind of funny, Stan seems about as interested in Doreen as she is in him, so hey, we found something in common already. Neither of us wants to be here. Honestly, the script seemed like it was trying almost too hard to make Doreen unlikable. And, this brought another phrase from the future of an offshoot of Gene's future work to mind. She's where fun goes to die.
I mean, nice interpretations of where this is going to go. But you're right. The way that they kind of frame Doreen, the way that Gene writes for Doreen, and even the way that she's directed, there's a certain tone for this character. And maybe we see an episode like this, which is done in a half hour or less, around 27 minutes. This is the kind of episode that would probably take an hour to really develop it in today's storytelling and architecture, because there's a lot going on with the arc of this character. But I think that because has to be so condensed, everything has to be a little bit more animated and exaggerated. Early in the episode, she tells Carol that she wants a porter to handle her bags. She also says that, do you really think one of these officers, would-be officers, could even afford my nylon bills? Right? She also says, I know what 4 bedrooms on the North Shore cost, and I know what not having them costs, too. So we know that there's an economy of writing here to immediately set Doreen's tone and her attitude of she's high maintenance. She is begrudgingly there. You literally had to drag her there, right? Or Carol did, in order for her to see her boyfriend to be. So there's a lot going on with, again, the kind of like the concentrated, condensed stereotyping that's going on Doreen's character. And I think that's why she's just a little bit over the top, a little bit too framed to be unlikable.
Yeah, this trope, this archetype, it has a name. And unfortunately, Gene put it on the shelf and shined a spotlight on it in another of his works. And this one was his work. In Where No Man Has Gone Before, Dr. Elizabeth Daner. I think Gary Mitchell refers to her as a walking freezer unit. It's the Ice Queen.
Right.
And there are all sorts of unpleasant implications there, but she is definitely filling that role. And yes, again, we have 20-something minutes of screen time to tell this story. And yet, I still wonder about the pacing, because it seems like we spent an awful lot of time playing basketball in the middle of it.
I was looking at that scene, and I think that, in some way, I think that was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back part of this episode, where you can't just keep reinforcing or forcing down Doreen's throat, like, how great Stan is. Stan's a super athlete. Stan's a super student. He's a super cadet. He's everything that you want in a West Point man and more. No matter how much you want it, if you don't want it, it will never be attractive. You know, like, no matter how much other people want that for you, I should say. And I wanted to go back and kind of like dial this back a little bit, because I really wanted to talk about some of the really interesting things in the costuming as well in this episode. Now, there is a scene where Stan and Ray are having a conversation about their potential drag events that are coming up, and how Ray is kind of dragging Stan, so to speak, into, you know, his particular plans for the weekend. I didn't know this, but when Stan is putting on his daily uniform to go back to duty, the white, what I assumed were collars that were on his shirt and on his cuffs were actually built into the jacket, so that you have this perfect 1/8 to 1/4 inch white, I guess it's almost like piping, that's on the uniform. And I thought it was a shirt, so it's kind of neat to see that in behind the scenes.
Yeah, I remember noticing that and wondering, okay, is that a layer, or is that part of the same costume?
Yeah, it looked like it was sewn into the white border. It's almost like a clerical collar was like sewn into the collar of the jacket. And then also they look like French cuffed sleeves, but those are also sewn into the wrist area, the wrist cuffs of the jacket. So all he had underneath him was a t-shirt. Then he had the jacket with the faux trimming, you know, that was peeking out. Really sharp looking, though. You know, really, really sharp. And uniform on a uniform.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way to make sure that, you know, your cuffs aren't, you know, showing too much of the undershirt. There's no undershirt there. The cuffs are part of the jacket. That's cool. I like that idea.
Yeah, but I also like how that scene is juxtaposed with like a following scene where you see Doreen unpacking with the rest of the drags, and her hair, her makeup, her dress were all pitch perfect of an upstate socialite. And they're almost framing her as being too gorgeous, and she knows it. So again, like to your point earlier, they are framing Doreen in such a way where you can't help but dislike where she is right now.
I wish this was a case where we had the scripts and not just the shows. We've mentioned this with West Point. We only have the episodes. The scripts are not even in the archives, or at least we haven't found them yet. I would love to see on paper what Gene's description of Doreen was.
Exactly, yeah, with the way that she was styled, her hair, her dress, all that kind of thing. But yes, because there's a certain, like, again, in your mind's eye, there's what we would think of it, but we don't have the reference of 1950, of what a socialite in the 1950s, unless you go to, like, you know, Breakfast at Tiffany's, looking at Audrey Hepburn, you know, or, you know, Marilyn Monroe, you know, or Doris Day, you know, actresses of that kind of style of the time. I found it funny that the same dorm room scene, a lot happens in this dorm room scene, just as much as a lot happens in the basketball scene, but it doesn't. In the dorm room scene, one of the drags actually pulls out her own coffee pot, coffee cups, and I think another drag comes in from another room and like brings another coffee pot and just, you know, their own stuff. West Point won't provide that for them in this dorm room? It's a little strange.
Well, it's like they point out, you know, this is not the Hilton. This is a government facility. It's a government temporary housing facility. So I would say, yeah, if you want coffee, probably the safest bet is to bring your own kit.
And that holds true today.
Yeah.
So going back to what you were talking about with the basketball scene, I think that is in tandem with the scene prior to that, where one of the drags is talking to Doreen, and she basically kind of finishes what this other drag was saying, like, oh, because, yes, I've heard it all. You're West Point. This is West Point. And then she says, why does everyone have to cram West Point down my throat? You can feel that the frustration is at peak. And then when we get the basketball game, albeit too long and obviously not enough exposition aside from a bunch of guys like doing the same passing routine over and over and over again, you have Carol and Ray saying, he's the greatest ever. And she's like, I am so tired of this. Just shut up about it already.
He's such a dreamboat.
He is. Calvin Klein has nothing on this guy.
Later on, when Doreen and Stan are sitting at this little booth at the soda fountain or wherever this is on the West Point campus, and trying to get to know each other, she's talking about, we keep having an argument every couple of minutes. Let's have our next argument in the fresh air. Did these read to you as arguments? They read to me as extremely mild, inconsequential differences of opinion. Is this kind of a character tell, do you think, that she views these as earth-shattering arguments and not just, you're into that? Well, I'm not into that, but that's okay.
I think that it's kind of pointing at just the sheer level of drama as it relates to the time. If a man or a woman acts contrary to how society has expected them to be, raised them to be, then it becomes dramatic. And then a disagreement becomes an argument. I can't even imagine what the other drags were thinking about Doreen when she just lashes out at everyone. They must have thought that she was insane or just better than why do you think you're better than any of us? You're here for the same reason. But the thing is that she's not. And I think that that's the whole point of when she said to Stan, you can relax, Mr. Colton. I'm not here on a husband hunting expedition. Now, I think that this is one of those lines where it's just atypical of the women and how they were raised at the time. I'm not making an observation on whether or not socially or culturally it's appropriate, but at the time, from what we understand, this is something that is contrary to how maybe a woman of this societal level was raised. And I think that that's where, okay, this is interesting. Maybe a viewer would see this interesting. I'm not sure. I wasn't there. We didn't live there at that time. But on a far more important note, at least in my opinion. So when Stan's giving Doreen the campus tour earlier, and it was cold, you could tell it was cold because the wind was whipping their hair around, and, Stan was wearing this trench coat, and you know me, I love trench coats. And this is a very specific trench coat. It's called the Long O. It's a double-breasted, full-length trench coat with a half cape. It's one of my all-time favorite cuts of a coat. It's also known as, in some circles, as the Inverness coat.
I wonder if the line about, it's windy out here, isn't it? I wonder if that was even in the script, or if that's one of those things that they got out on location, and it's just like, holy crap, this is blowing everything every which way. We have to acknowledge it in the script, or it's going to seem weird that we're not talking about the weather. But yeah, I definitely noticed the coat, and I was like, oh man, that looks so cozy.
In Act 2, and it starts off with, and maybe I'm a sucker for rom-com stuff, but I do love having or watching that conversation edited back and forth between Stan and Doreen. Doreen calls him to cancel out on him, and Stan's like, well, I wanted you to cancel out on me, and I wanted to call you so you could. I'm like, okay. And there's this awkwardness. It's just, there's this nice, wonderful, awkward timing that's going on between them back and forth. I thought the editing was really good. I like that you're starting to see kind of like both of their expectations start to kind of like get challenged a little bit with each other.
The second act, for me, is much better than the first. Because so much of the first act is spent, we have to make her unlikable. We have to make her unlikable. You don't have to make her that unlikable. And at the same time, we're talking about how much the script makes Doreen unlikable. I think the script is also very specifically doing something with all of her roommates, with Carol and the other girls, because if these girls were any more Google-eyed, it would be like Lena Hyena from the cartoons. I'm gonna get me a man!
Yeah, ooh,
exactly.
Right? It's the same energy, right? Yeah, and I really do think that the scene where, again, just like the basketball scene, the scene that broke the camel's back the second time, because there are, 2 times, I guess, it's when Doreen snaps at the hotel clerk, when she asks for her bill so she can leave, And he goes, why? What's wrong? And she goes, look, I simply asked for my bill. Do I have to submit an official resignation? I mean, I'm like, wait, hold on a second, lady. That's a little out of line, right? You know, this guy's just asking you if everything's okay. He's doing his service job. But she does capitulate very quickly and says, look, I'm sorry. And you know that that's coming from a point of frustration because she just had that conversation with Stan. And things just aren't going her way. And by the nature of what we've learned of her so far, everything in her life has gone her way. Everything. You know, she's obviously from a well-to-do family. She's obviously from a well-to-do society. She dresses the part. She acts the part. If you're not fawning over her or throwing your coat over a puddle, then there's going to be drama. There's going to be issues, right? And please don't tell her what to do unless you are of a higher stature, because only then in this society can you tell her what to do. So yeah, it was an interesting scene. Very well acted, I think.
I almost wished we could have cut down on some of the basketball montage and spent more time with that guy. Kind of have him be, you know, almost like Jiminy Cricket, off to one side observing, watching this whole thing with this knowing, sly smile. Because he has probably seen this play out so many times.
So when Doreen says she'll wait for the bus, and then the hotel manager says, well, it's going to be a 2-hour wait, do you think that when she's looking for her thinking spot that she's hoping to run into Stan?
I wondered about that, because it seems like such an obvious coincidence. And there is some obviousness. There is some stuff in this episode that just seems awfully paint by numbers. And so I don't know if that's intentional, but from a story structure standpoint, it's, you know, we've already established it at the thinking spot, so it's a super obvious way to get her and Stan back together, so they can talk about ancient Roman emperors. Mm-hmm. Somewhere in the universe, second technician Arnold J. Rimmer is missing his soulmate. And there is our first and possibly final Red Dwarf reference for Gene-ology.
And anytime I hear the name Tiberius come up in conversation, my ears perk up.
Well, of course, because it makes you think of William Tiberius Rice, the hero of Gene's future show, The Lieutenant.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Thank you, Earl. Thank you.
Now, they deploy the phrase several times in the second act. No strings attached. Absolutely no strings attached. There is no way to drag this script in the 21st century, because, boy, is the meaning of that term changed to something completely different in 2024 than it was in 1956. Hello!
And the funny thing is when they say that this time, like no strings attached, no expectations, this is entering romantic comedy, territory, because the looks on their faces are saying a completely other thing. It's very tongue-in-cheek.
If you people had any more strings attached, you would be freaking puppets.
Exactly. I do love, though, when Doreen finally dances with Stan. There's a song that I love. It's an old standard from Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong, called Cheek to Cheek. And this describes that entire scene perfectly. Here are the lyrics. Heaven, I'm in heaven, and my heart beats so that I can hardly speak. And I seem to find the happiness I seek when we're out together dancing cheek to cheek. That's the moment, right? That's the moment where both of their worlds just kind of collide and they don't even see it coming. And I don't know, man. I get caught up in this, in this kind of stuff. I'm a softie. What can I say?
I like how the second act, when we get to the formal dance, and there's no dialogue between her and Stan during the dance. We don't hear what they're saying. I'm assuming they're having a steamy conversation about Roman emperors, but I don't know. But, we do catch up with all the other girls going, oh, hey, look at what's going on over there. And I kind of liked that.
And it's also kind of maybe projection on their part because, they're not completely satisfied, with where their relationships are going right now. Again, I don't know. But when they see this happen, they're like, oh, okay, it's working out for somebody. Because it doesn't probably work out for every drag that comes on campus. But I do like that towards the end of the episode, they're caught up in this romance that they weren't expecting, that they lost track of time. And, Stan's like, well, I got to get to my barracks in like a minute and a half. And then Doreen doesn't know where she's going to go. But he goes, I got to go. I got to leave. And he kisses her. And he looks at his watch at the same time. He's like, okay, I'm going to get the kiss that I wanted, but also make curfew so that I don't get demerited. And I was like, that's pretty consistent for a character like this. He's like, he still understands that I am still a cadet here. I can't go any further than this. I can't be, and you know what? Hammerov, that would have been a completely different story. And at the end, Doreen, she says that she kind of floats up back to the dormitory, and the rest of the drags are there and saying like, what happened? And, she kind of like, alludes to that, they got together, and then Carol comes up and says, you love him. And she goes, well, she doesn't say that. She just says, it's crazy how I feel. And I like that it's not just, yes, I love him. I'm going to marry him. We're going to fall in love. We're going to have children. We're going to have all this kind of stuff. She's like, no, it's just whatever happened between the two of us was unexpected. And she enjoys that.
Norman, at first, I found it really hard to relate to this one or enjoy it as much as I have the previous episodes we've covered. And not because of an aversion to romantic stories or romantic comedy. There's just a weird pacing to it. We keep fixating on, we interrupt this broadcast to bring you lots of scenes of basketball. Now, I noticed in the end credits that they mentioned that the basketball scenes were coordinated by the basketball coach at the U.S. Military Academy. So West Point's own basketball guru was behind these scenes. And I wonder if this was some stipulation that they agreed to. Could we show off the West Point basketball team in one of your episodes? Because it sure felt like, boy, we've got to meet this obligation.
Yeah, there's that, and there's the other possibility that it's playing into what we suspect about West Point all along, and it's basically a recruiting tool for young men to see what West Point is like on campus, and even extracurricular activities. Because we have yet to see a football team, which is one of the sports legacies of West Point, the West Point football team. But they have the basketball team, too, and they probably have a track team, and they probably have a swim, all of the teams. Because, their would-be candidates, their prospective candidates who are in the audience of the time are going to look at this and say like, oh, yeah, cool. Okay, maybe I can go for a scholarship here. Or maybe I can, pursue not just academic interests, but athletic interests as well. So I think it's neat to see like a more, albeit I think that the scene was probably too long to reinforce a particular point. But it is nice to see that you're seeing so many different grounds now, across the West Point episodes that we've seen so far. And we're only going to see 10 out of 37, is it?
Yeah, Gene wrote a quarter of them, which that's a lot for one writer. But, you're on staff. That's what you're there to do. If everyone else dries up, you better come up with something. Now, there is one scene I really liked a lot from kind of the romantic standpoint. And we were talking about this a bit in Observations. This is the scene where Stan and Doreen bump into each other at Stan's thinking spot at the Memorial Monument. Whereas earlier in the episode, Doreen was painted in what seemed like the most unfavorable light possible. She's almost like the arch-villain. Mm-hmm. And, I brought up the characters of the Commissioner in the Star Trek episode Metamorphosis, or Dr. Elizabeth Daner in We're No Man. It's an archetypal trope that Gene has employed more than once. So it's a thing. But this conversation at the monument at night seemed like it was a conversation between real people, and I liked how tentative it is. That really kind of heightened the romantic element of it. And I really liked that. It felt like, oh, we're dealing with real characters here and not caricatures.
That's a really good point, and I think that's where I really started to enjoy and really get into these two characters when the pretense that was surrounding them started to kind of like fade away. Because in the beginning, we saw that Doreen is being framed to be a certain character type. Every single drag or every single other woman that she was spending time with in her scenes were all these different facets of women that seemed to be the type of like superfluous personality of the time. They're only there for one specific reason. And it shows, right? They have a specific agenda, even if, and I'm going to get to this like later on in our final discussion points. So you have all of these women kind of reflecting back on maybe what Doreen doesn't want to be, which kind of only reinforces kind of like the obstinance of her character where she is right now in this event, in this weekend. But then you also have Stan, who's been maneuvered by Ray, his roommate, to do this. And, going back to the whole duty, honor, obligation, loyalty thing to his own roommate, he's like, well, okay, I'm going to help this guy out of a jam. And I like that they both Doreen and Stan both bring all of this baggage to their first date together, and it shows. Because you know that he doesn't want to be there, she doesn't want to be there, but they still make the best of it anyway because they're trying to be mature, responsible, young adults. And maybe that's, again, like, I wish I could just teleport myself into the watching eyes of the audience of the time, because you and I have watched enough TV to know that every single generation era of TV from like the 1950s to now, there's a certain escalation of how emotions are portrayed and how condensed and how serious they are in the scale of where they are at the time. So a peck on the cheek or a flutter of an eye or a brushing of the hand across a cheek, that's intense, for the 1950s. Today, if you are literally not doing the Maverick Kelly McGillis French kiss swap, in today's narrative, that is basically not even romantic at all, even though it is grossly overdone. But that's today, right? So looking at the way that they react to each other from the 1950s, you're like, oh, that's so intense. Because I think it's supposed to be for the time.
That being said, I have to tell you about my guy crush on Stan here. He's a great character, up to a point. I know that we've talked about the trope of, the Ice Queen character, and I suppose an officer and a gentleman is just as much of a trope. But Stan really impresses me here. He is reading the room successfully. He is respecting Doreen's boundaries. He's not being pushy. He's not trying to wear her down with charm, which is a phrase that I really detest. I really like all these things about Stan. He's a great character. And then at the end, it just seems kind of weird that things have shifted enough that suddenly he's got to get that kiss in before time runs out, and he misses curfew. And of course, we don't want the foundations of West Point to crumble. So suddenly, he's like a whole different character. Now, I know there's some time lapse that's going on here. They were apparently at the dance for quite some time, enjoying each other's company. They got there long before Doreen's bus would have arrived because they were killing time. And that was actually their exact phrase, we got some time to kill. And they stayed until long after it was supposed to leave. So I get that there is a lot of time they spent together that we did not see as part of the show. So, sure, maybe he's gotten a bit smitten. But I really liked the Stan who was being very respectful of Doreen's boundaries.
Yeah, and I think that that's the flip side of the conversation you were bringing up earlier in observations, where you felt like Doreen was being maybe like overgeneralized in a category of being unlikable, because we are dealing with a 27-minute time frame. So you really have to get your points across very quickly and maybe a little bit too obviously. So yes, Stan's like his complete, his change of personality is going to happen in a far more condensed, and compacted way, because this is literally in the last 2 minutes of this episode. And yeah, Gene did write, a nice economical line of them losing track of time, of him, having her out for 2 more hours than he expected. She missed her bus. He's about to miss curfew. So yeah, there's that. And I think that, again, in the vernacular of the 1950s type of romance, when you lose that much track of time, that means you're falling in love. That means that all the world around you just fades away. And even Carol said that to Doreen at the end. She's like, well, you didn't even notice the rest of us in the room looking at you. Yeah, he's like, you were like staring into his big brown eyes, and she quickly corrected him, saying blue eyes. So you know that she's right. But I think that, yeah, if this were like more of kind of like an Hours, rom-com kind of format, you would have seen a lot more of maybe interaction with the other characters, which I think would have helped round the character subversions overall.
And hey, at least the show isn't set in the 70s, because it would be like, he almost missed curfew, she missed her bust, they fight crime. Tonight after Macmillan and Wife.
Before I get into a history lesson, there is one thing, though, that I'd like to discuss. And let's talk about the dormitory drags and a possible impact they may have made on young female viewers of this show. Because we have a huge assumption that it's just young men that are watching this show, but what if it's not the case? Now, I assume that when the young male audience of the time, 1956, 57, when they were watching this show, when they're watching scenes like the women who are gathering in Doreen's dormitory room, they're getting ready for the socials, it's easy to see how this type of a scene is a possible type of recruiting tool, like we've alluded to in the past with how West Point is trying to portray, their organization, their school in a way where it makes it more appealing to a young intended audience, the young male intended audience. Now, a young man at the time is like looking at the TV and it's like, hey, maybe I can find a wife there, who's pretty and who would fall in love with me and that quickly as well.
Yeah, oh man, you're getting into an area that I originally had a huge screed written up in my notes and then deleted it because I thought, this is going way off point. But the thought occurred to me that, yeah, definitely, it's like, hey, young men out there in the audience, look at this. Hardware, uniforms, discipline, future career possibilities, and if that's not enough for you, dames.
The women!
That really kind of led me into a really kind of icky headspace because we have this very odious mindset now of young men who are not as disciplined as these West Point cadets are. And I'm starting to think maybe that's a problem because you have men now of quite an age spread, I should add, who have this terrible mindset that they are somehow owed a mate. And maybe they're thinking wives, maybe they're thinking something purely physical, absolutely no strings attached. But no, men, you are not owed anything. And so there was part of this, it just felt a little bit icky that, we're adding that to the inducement of military life.
I think it's far more attractive than, say, like a basketball scene recruitment tool. But aside from that, though, which is a valid point, and I think we're going to bring this up probably later on in other West Point reviews, but I was also thinking, what about the young women who may have been watching alongside, say, their brother or their cousin or a friend, like a best friend? What if these women saw how the women in this episode were being portrayed as their example of how to better themselves, maybe to get out of their mediocre lot in life, where the men around them, as you were alluding to, Earl, weren't interested in providing them with a secure future as the men of West Point are being raised or trained to do, with family, with children, with a home, with financial stability. That's what these West Point men are being trained and reared to do because they're going to have careers in the Army. They're going to be respected leaders of their community eventually because that's where the progression goes from there. And I'm glad that you've brought up Officer and a Gentleman several times because this is essentially the same story with a different outcome. And it's like in the era of My Three Sons or Leave It to Beaver meets An Officer and a Gentleman, because the outcome of the movie, with Richard Gere and the great Lou Gossett Jr., and Deborah Winger, great movie. The outcome isn't exactly like this, but the intent of Deborah Winger's character and her friend was the same.
There are societal norms here that just raise all kind of red flags to my 21st century mentality, and so I'm going to try not to get off into those weeds, but we're talking about these young men are being raised and they will have future careers after their military service. But if you think about it, because we've brought up John Rambo before, this is very much a timestamp thing that does not stick around forever. Because your men coming back from Vietnam, and in some cases from Korea, were not perceived in that same way. They did not have shining career prospects or a bright future just because they had served. And at a certain point, that stops being the expectation. And so it's very, you said it, Leave It to Beaver, it's very kind of naive, very innocent, and very much of its time.
Yeah. And now I want to get into, because it's of its time, like why we've been emphasizing the word drag a lot in this episode. And, it's because there's a history lesson here. And I know how some of you have enjoyed going into these anachronisms with us, anachronisms because it doesn't really fit. This phrase, drag, doesn't really fit on our time. When I heard Charles Thompson use the term drag to describe Doreen and the other women that went, to this event in this episode, I had to go down this rabbit hole of what does this mean? Because at one point in time, we talked about wind wings on a car. In Mr. District Attorney, we talked about Black Betty, I think, in Mr. District Attorney. These are phrases that we weren't... Was that...
I thought it was Black Maria.
Is it Black Maria? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's the car.
Yeah, Black Betty is bow, 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 bow.
That's probably where it was coming from. But again, it's out of context for us in terms of our time, but very significant during the time of when it was written. So I took a look at the definition of drag as it applies to this episode and into context of West Point specifically in the late 1950s. Now, from westpoint.org, drag, the term used in the 1960s, either meant 1, your date, 2, dragging pro, which is just an extension of the word drag, meaning a good-looking date, and 3, dragging D, or a deficient-looking date. I guess you don't want to be dragging D.
No, life is not better in the
Not
D.
in this case. Now, from another online magazine, Combat Magazine Online, its glossary of West Point terms has drag stating, a young lady whom a cadet is escorting, being so called from the old Army term for a spouse and dependent children. So there is, and it also brings up dragging pro and dragging D. So now you're feeling kind of like the extension of not just a date, but other trappings that come along with a relationship. Now, as we saw later in this episode, in the context of the dance, and this is where it just lit me up. I loved this information, especially how the cadets and their dates dance in this dance. From the Oxford English Online Dictionary, drag, entry example 4, subsection 29b, from 1910 forward. Drag is a dance characterized by a slow movement and dragging of the feet, usually while holding a partner closely in a romantic or intimate manner. Subsection 29c from 1921 onward, North American slang for dancing or a dance. Subsection 29d from 1926 to 1959, U.S. college slang and military slang, a woman who accompanies a man to a dance, party, or other social occasion, a man's female date for a social event. So in the context of this era of U.S. history, and specifically in this episode, the dance itself is the drag, and the female partner is the prospective drag personified through the style and manner of dance.
That's fascinating. I really did wonder, and I failed to dig into it. I really wondered where the term came from, and I almost think the reason I didn't look it up was I was afraid it was going to be something terribly derogatory that I just didn't want to tarnish this sweet little episode.
I mean, it's easy to assume that, they're a drag on your style. They're a drag on your freedom. They're a drag on your resources, your income, your free time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But no, it's a far less nefarious, far less toxic, and far more innocent word than that associated with the actual dance itself. Because, again, my favorite part of this episode is when you see them dancing cheek to cheek, and he's literally kind of dragging her across the floor because they're in this swoon of a relationship that's overcome them.
All right, Norman, we have dragged this out as far as we can. We are wrapping up our discussion of a double reverse. By the way, that's one thing I forgot to mention in trivia. It depends on where you look, but this episode either shows up as a double reverse or just double reverse. I kind of like a double reverse better, because the funny thing is both characters reverse their positions from where you saw them at the beginning of the episode.
And I'm also wondering if this is some type of military term that we haven't looked up yet, because even the drags at the end, when they were like rallying around Doreen, they were talking about things in military terms.
Yeah, boy, you're leaning into the most painfully obvious line at the end of the episode, I have met the enemy, I am his. It's like, oh no, we were doing so good up until then. That is such a written line and just doesn't feel like something someone would actually say. And so, yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go there. From a script standpoint, a lot of this episode is very rote. Of course he's going to get the girl by the end credits. In some places, it seems like it's going through the motions, and where you want to spend more time getting into the characters, instead, we're literally dribbling. So much dribbling. The Ice Queen trope is predictable. The fact that she is going to melt is predictable. The biggest surprise, really, is how much basketball there is in the middle of the episode to fill time, and I wonder if this script came up short, or just what drove that decision. I don't want to compare absolutely everything Gene writes to The Secret Weapon of 117, because that script made it very clear that Gene can write a good, unexpected romance and make it feel authentic and fun. This seems a little bit paint by numbers by comparison. It's very lighthearted, very low stakes, and to give Gene a little bit of wiggle room here, that may be exactly what CBS or Ziv wanted the week after Christmas. He may have been under instructions to keep it safe and simple.
Well, as I mentioned before, and not in so many words, but I am a sucker for these kind of romantic stories. I always have been. And I'm not exactly sure where that came from, but there's something about the simplicity and this kind of like uncomplicated aesthetic of the 1950s that's I've always found very appealing. But then again, and many of you who follow Mission Log, you know that I'm Asian, Filipino, and Chinese. So in the 1950s, I didn't live in that era, and I think I certainly would have had a different perspective in that era as a person of color. But all that being said, I still love the innocence of how I felt when I watched Marty McFly return to the 1950s, Hill Valley. You saw a car pull up to a garage, to get gas, and then four men in their perfectly pressed coveralls came to service the car. It was quiet. It was the era personified. And I loved how we watched throughout the story his parents fall in love at the enchantment under the sea dance. The way that they looked in each other's eyes when they kissed and saved the future. Yeah, I'm a softie that way. I like that aesthetic. I saw more of this episode as Doreen's character making a certain point about arranged marriages and relationships. In my opinion, she had the stronger character arc because she is the character in this episode that was challenging and questioning the conventional model of the time, i.e. the husband hunt. The women, quote-unquote, taking one for the West Point team, so to speak. Doing one's duty and honor for the love of country. But Doreen wasn't really swayed in this way by any of this from the get-go, and I do appreciate, as I mentioned before, that Gene wrote her in a tone in such a way where she was somewhat put off by all this. Now, even though in the end she did fall in love with Stan, or that was our assumption, it was her decision after overcoming certain misconceptions about him, herself, and like the environment, the predicament they were both forced to endure, because there's an obligation that she needed to meet, and there was an obligation that Stan needed to meet that forced them into this obligation that they were trapped in as a couple because of their friends, because of their loyalty to their friends, which does say something about that. Now, is this episode couched in all of the cultural trimmings of the time? Absolutely. Without question, right? But I have to believe that even the writing level of, say, the independence that Doreen flexed for most of this episode was something completely different than, say, for the intended audience of the time that they were used to, especially the young men. Doreen in this episode had agency right up until the end, and perhaps more than most of the female characters that were written at this time. Take a look at the four women that were, kind of like her contemporaries, her peers, that, they were there for the same reason. So I think that this was a solid example of Gene writing for women and giving, at least in this episode, Doreen a chance to come to terms with her own decisions and to make up her own mind about her future. Again, in the end, it was tropish, but the way we got there, I think, was very Gene.
Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. Special thanks to the Roddenberry Repertory players. Our cast this week featured Ryanne McKay as Doreen and Robin Nystrom as Stan. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, jet flight.
Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Tom Kozak, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.